A police officer returned to Minneapolis after years of duty, carrying nothing but a fragile newborn daughter and the hope of starting over. At his side walked Buddy, his loyal German shepherd, guarding them with every step through the winter snow. But instead of open arms, he was met with rejection doors slammed shut, whispers of doubt, and shadows that seemed to grow darker with every street he crossed. With nowhere to turn, a weary father, his baby girl, and their faithful dog began a journey through hardship, faith, and the quiet miracles that only God can provide. What happened next would test the limits of loyalty and reveal how grace often appears in the unlikeliest places. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe every child deserves protection and a safe home, hit that subscribe button, because this story may remind you that God still works wonders through love, courage, and second chances. Snow drifted across the streets of Minneapolis like sheets of broken glass, carried by the wind that howled between the tall gray buildings of downtown. It was Christmas Eve, but there was no warmth in the air, no carols drifting from the windows, only the relentless storm that turned the city into a battlefield of ice and silence. Streetlights glowed faintly, their halos blurred by the flurries, as if the city itself struggled to stay awake under winter's heavy hand. Against this frozen backdrop, a lone figure moved slowly, hunched against the cold. Officer John Miller, 35 years old, trudged forward with a child in his arms. His uniform jacket had been replaced by a civilian winter coat that was far too thin for the weather. John was tall, broad-shouldered, his once sharply cut hair now disheveled under a wool cap pulled low. His hazel eyes, usually steady and trained to notice details as a police officer, were dull with exhaustion and shadowed by grief. His jawline was strong but unshaven, a weak stubble adding to the rugged, almost desperate look of a man who had stopped caring about appearances. What weighed on him more than the storm was the tiny body pressed against his chest, his daughter Grace. Wrapped in layers of threadbare blankets, the infant whimpered faintly, her breath forming small clouds that quickly vanished into the icy air. She was only 6 months old, fragile and pale, her tiny fists twitching with the instinct of a newborn fighting to survive a world that had already stolen her mother. Sarah, John's wife, had been the kind of woman people remembered easily. She was 28, slender and tall, with chestnut hair that always carried the faint scent of lavender, and soft green eyes that seemed to search out the good in everyone. A nurse in training, Sarah had a gentle touch and a smile that made patients believe everything would be all right. But her kindness had been forged in hardship. She had grown up moving from foster home to foster home, after losing her parents in a car accident at 10 years old. The lack of stability made her fiercely protective of the family she created with John. Perhaps that was why she had worked so tirelessly through pregnancy, refusing to let fear dictate her choices. But fate had been merciless. Complications during childbirth had taken her life, leaving John with Grace and a silence so heavy it haunted every waking moment. John's world collapsed in those sterile hospital halls 6 months ago. He had held Sarah's hand as doctors fought to save her, had begged them to try again when they shook their heads, and had whispered her name into the void after the monitors fell silent. His career as a police officer had taught him to keep his composure under chaos, but nothing in his training prepared him for the moment he had to hold his daughter for the first time alone, knowing Sarah would never kiss the child she had longed for. Now, with debt suffocating him and eviction notices taped to his door, John had run out of options. The tiny apartment above the laundromat on 7th Street was no longer theirs. The landlord had shown a sliver of patience after Sarah's funeral but had grown cold when the bills remained unpaid. Tonight, the eviction was final. John had gathered what little he could, mostly baby blankets and an old wool throw that still faintly smelled of Sarah, and left with Grace pressed to his chest. He had not told anyone, no relatives to call, no friends close enough to trust with his daughter's life. His only thought had been to walk to the hospital, hoping the emergency room would accept Grace, give her warmth, milk, and care at least until he found another way. The storm bit into his skin with each gust. Minneapolis in December was unrelenting. Temperatures below zero, wind slicing through even the thickest fabric, sidewalks buried under ice that cracked beneath each heavy step. John's boots, worn down from years of patrol duty, were soaked through. His feet felt numb, his fingers stiff as he adjusted the blankets around Grace. She stirred faintly, a soft whimper escaping her lips. He bent his head down, whispering hoarsely, "It's okay, baby girl. Daddy's got you." just a little longer. His voice was still rough from the throat injury he had suffered in the line of duty years ago, when a suspect's knife had nearly taken his life. Every word came out raspy, as if the pain of old wounds lingered in his vocal cords. Through the curtain of snow, a dim yellow light flickered from a kitchen window. Inside, Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her early 70s, stood watching from behind thin curtains. She was a short, wiry figure with white hair tied neatly in a bun, wearing a faded cardigan that smelled faintly of mothballs. Known around the neighborhood as the kind who called the police whenever teenagers skateboarded too loudly or when trash cans were left uncollected, she prided herself on keeping the streets safe. Her sharp eyes narrowed at the sight of John stumbling through the snow with what looked like a bundle. From a distance, she couldn't tell it was a baby. To her, in the haze of storm and suspicion, he looked like a man sneaking off with something stolen. She muttered under her breath, "What's he up to now?" and reached for the phone to call the police. Meanwhile, across town, in the police station's warm kennels, Buddy, the German shepherd, paced restlessly. 6 years old, Buddy was a striking animal with thick black and tan fur, amber eyes that glowed sharp under the fluorescent lights, and a muscular frame that still bore the scars of his military service. His left flank carried a faint mark from shrapnel, his right ear bent slightly from an explosion years ago. Though retired from combat tours, Buddy had not forgotten discipline. Each step was measured, his ears twitching at every sound. Officer Ryan Cooper, a young patrol officer of 27 with sandy blonde hair and an earnest but impatient nature, sat nearby sipping coffee. He was tall and lean, his uniform neatly pressed, his blue eyes holding both curiosity and arrogance, the kind of man who wanted to prove himself quickly but lacked the patience of experience. He glanced at the restless dog and said, "What's got into you, old boy? Storm bothering you?" Buddy growled softly, his hackles lifting as if sensing something beyond Ryan's comprehension. Back on the street, John struggled to push forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, each exhale a ghost in the wind. Grace grew quieter, which terrified him more than her cries. Babies were supposed to wail, supposed to demand life. Silence meant danger. He pressed his lips to her forehead, chilled despite the layers of fabric, and quickened his pace, though his legs felt like lead. He thought of Sarah, her laugh, her promise that everything would be fine, and he clung to those memories like lifelines. The city seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, faint sirens began to wail, cutting through the storm's roar. Mrs. Henderson's call had been answered. Patrol cars were on their way. John, oblivious to the fact he had been reported, kept moving toward the faint glow of the hospital's emergency room sign, a promise of salvation glimmering through the whiteout. Behind him, tire tracks carved through the snow as police vehicles moved closer, their headlights slicing across the dark. Inside one of those cars sat Officer Ryan, tightening Buddy's leash as the German shepherd leaned forward, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the storm ahead. Something in his chest vibrated with recognition, though he didn't yet know why. And so the stage was set, a grieving police officer with his fragile daughter braving the storm for survival, a watchful neighbor whose suspicions summoned law enforcement, and a war dog whose past was about to collide with his present. On that bitter Minneapolis night, under snow that fell like shattered glass, lives that had long been broken by grief, loss, and duty were about to converge. The storm thickened as Minneapolis seemed to fold in on itself, streets disappearing under layers of white. Officer John Miller could barely make out the faint glow of the hospital ahead when the wail of sirens reached his ears, sharp and urgent. He froze for a moment, his instincts as a policeman clashing with his current reality. He wasn't on duty tonight. He was the man being approached, the one seen as suspicious. Grace stirred weakly in his arms, her small lips tinged blue, and John pulled her closer, whispering to calm her, though his own voice trembled. Headlights broke through the curtain of snow, flooding the street with harsh white beams. 3 patrol cars slid to a stop, tires crunching over ice. Doors opened with heavy thuds, and uniformed figures stepped out, their dark winter coats flapping in the wind. At the center was Chief Robert Hayes, a man in his early 50s. Broad-shouldered but with the stiff posture of someone carrying too many years of grief, his face bore the tired lines of both authority and sorrow. His hair, once black, had gone mostly silver, cropped short under his fur-lined hat. His pale blue eyes were piercing, a gaze honed by decades in law enforcement but shadowed by loss. Hayes had buried his only son, a 19-year-old who died in Afghanistan, and since then, his warmth had hardened into a brittle shell. Duty defined him, but bitterness colored every judgment he made about veterans, about sacrifice, about dogs like Buddy. Behind Hayes stood Officer Ryan Cooper, the young patrolman from the kennels, now bundled in his heavy winter jacket. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and his impatient energy was evident even in the storm. He wanted to prove himself, to handle situations quickly, decisively, without wasting time. To his right, another officer emerged. Detective Laura Simmons, late 30s, tall and lean with dark brown hair pulled back beneath a knit cap. Laura had sharp cheekbones, gray eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for being methodical, unwilling to jump to conclusions. While Hayes embodied authority and Ryan embodied impulse, Laura represented caution. She had grown up the daughter of a factory worker, had seen her father wrongfully accused in a labor dispute, and ever since carried a deep suspicion of snap judgments. As the officers fanned out, Ryan called out first, his voice muffled by the storm. "Sir, stop right there! Show me your hands!" His tone was sharp, aggressive, intended to assert control. John tried to respond, but his damaged vocal cords betrayed him. What came out was a raspy whisper, words shredded by the wind. "Baby. Sick. Hospital." He lifted one hand, the other still holding Grace close, trying to show he wasn't a threat. To Ryan, the movement looked furtive, suspicious. He reached for his holster instinctively. Before tension could escalate further, the rear door of one patrol car swung open and Buddy leapt into the snow. The German Shepherd was alert, ears pricked forward, amber eyes glowing with focus. At 6 years old, Buddy had the muscle of a seasoned warrior but carried a limp from arthritis worsened by cold weather. His thick black and tan coat bristled as he locked onto the figure in the storm. Ryan tightened the leash immediately, pulling Buddy back, but the dog resisted, muscles quivering with recognition. John's hazel eyes widened as he saw the dog clearly for the first time. The scar along Buddy's left flank was unmistakable. Memories flooded back dust storms in Afghanistan, mortar shells exploding, the sound of Buddy's bark cutting through chaos. John whispered hoarsely, almost to himself, "Buddy." The name cut through the snowstorm like a spark in the dark. Buddy froze, ears snapping forward. The growl that had rumbled in his chest transformed into a high-pitched whine, a sound that came from deep memory, not training. His tail gave a tentative wag and he strained toward John. Ryan stumbled back, bewildered. "What the Chief? He's acting crazy!" Chief Hayes narrowed his eyes, his breath fogging in the frozen air. He had seen military dogs trained to loyalty, but this was different. The shepherd's behavior was urgent, emotional, almost human. He stepped closer, flashlight beam steady on John's face. The man before him was gaunt, stubble covering hollow cheeks, eyes sunken with exhaustion but still carrying the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Hayes recognized it instantly. The squared shoulders, the stance of someone trained to stand firm even when broken. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded, voice cutting through the storm. John fumbled in his coat pocket, his gloved fingers stiff from cold. With effort, he pulled out his police badge, worn but valid, the edges bent from years of use. He held it out, his hand trembling. Hayes took it, shining the beam over the inscription. Officer John Miller, Minneapolis Police Department. Ryan blinked, confused. "Wait, he's one of us?" he muttered, but his tone still carried suspicion. Detective Laura stepped forward, her cautious gaze softening slightly. She looked at Grace, her eyes widening as she saw the baby's tiny face peeking from the blankets. The infant's lips were dangerously pale, her breaths shallow. Laura's voice, firm but less harsh than Ryan's, broke the silence. "Chief, that baby doesn't have much time. Whatever else is going on here, she needs help now." Hayes glanced at Buddy, who had sat down in the snow, whining and circling restlessly, unable to pull his gaze from John. Something about the moment unsettled the chief. His mind flickered to his son Tommy, to letters he had once burned in anger that mentioned the loyalty of war dogs. For a brief second, he saw not a vagrant, but a father fighting against the storm for his child's life. Still, protocol gnawed at him. "We'll get the baby to the hospital," Hayes said finally, "but you answer questions once she's safe." "Understood?" John nodded, too drained to argue. his relief evident in the slump of his shoulders. Grace whimpered softly, and he kissed her forehead, murmuring again, "It's okay, sweetheart. Almost safe." As the group turned toward the patrol cars, another figure appeared from the shadows. Officer Mark Davies, in his 40s, with a bulky frame, thinning blonde hair beneath his cap, and a ruddy complexion from years of night patrols. He was known as a loyal follower of Hayes, often blunt and quick to enforce orders. "Chief, we sure about this?" Davies asked skeptically. Guy looks half-crazed. "Baby could be in danger." Laura cut in sharply. "Open your eyes, Mark. That baby is freezing to death. You think a man risks his life in this storm to harm his own kid?" Her words carried enough force to silence him, though his doubtful expression lingered. Buddy tugged once more at the leash, moving closer to John. When Ryan reluctantly loosened his grip, the shepherd pressed against John's legs, sniffing Grace gently, tail wagging faster now. The sight was enough to shift something in Hayes' chest. He felt the ice around his grief crack slightly. If this dog, trained for loyalty and precision, could still recognize his former partner after years apart, then perhaps this man wasn't a threat at all. The storm swirled around them, sirens fading as the engines idled, lights flashing across white drifts. John stood surrounded by suspicion, by authority, by the weight of his own desperation. But for the first time that night, he wasn't entirely alone. Buddy's warm breath rose in small clouds at his side, a silent vow of protection reignited by recognition. Hayes exhaled, his voice quieter now. "Let's move. Hospital's waiting." And with that command, the convoy turned toward Cedar Falls General Hospital, unaware that this fragile reunion in the snow was only the beginning of a battle that would test them all. The doors of Cedar Falls General Hospital swung open with a hiss as the bitter cold gave way to fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic. Officer John Miller staggered inside, his arms tightening around Grace as if she might slip away in the warmth after so many hours in the storm. His hazel eyes darted around, trained by instinct to read spaces, but now filled only with desperation. Snow melted quickly on his coat, dripping onto the polished linoleum floor as nurses rushed forward. At the forefront was Dr. Emily Torres, a woman in her early 40s, who carried herself with the steady grace of someone who had faced chaos and refused to break. She was of medium height, her frame lean from years of long shifts, her dark hair streaked with gray tied tightly back. Her brown skin was pale under the hospital's fluorescent glow, and her sharp brown eyes missed nothing. A former Army medic who had patched soldiers together in desert tents under mortar fire, Emily had come back to Minneapolis with scars that weren't visible on her skin. Her calm voice, however, held an authority that cut through noise. "Get me a warming unit, now!" she barked, as she reached for the bundle in John's arms. Her hands were firm but gentle as she lifted Grace, quickly assessing. The infant whimpered, her skin clammy, her breathing shallow. Emily's expression shifted instantly, professional focus tightening into urgency. She snapped orders, and two nurses rushed to obey. One was Nurse Kelly O'Donnell, a red-haired woman in her late 20s, freckled and slim, who moved quickly, but whose green eyes revealed her anxiety. Kelly had always been too soft-hearted, often crying after hard cases, but her loyalty to children made her an anchor on pediatric shifts. The other was Nurse Adam White, a tall, quiet man in his 30s with sandy hair, a stocky build, and a reputation for being efficient and unemotional, though his colleagues knew he carried grief for a sister lost in childhood illness. John stumbled after Emily, his voice rasping from exhaustion. She just needs warmth. Please." His words cracked, each syllable a struggle, but Emily held up a hand, not unkindly. "You did the right thing bringing her here. Let us take it from here." Chief Hayes, Detective Laura, and Officer Ryan entered behind him, snow still clinging to their coats. The hospital lights revealed their fatigue as clearly as their suspicion. Hayes remained grim, scanning John as if looking for cracks in his story. Laura, however, stayed close to the infant, her protective instinct stronger than her suspicion. Buddy padded in with them, leash in Ryan's hand, though the dog strained constantly toward John. Hospital staff eyed the shepherd nervously, but his amber gaze remained fixed on Grace, ears flicking at every sound she made. As Emily and her team moved Grace to a nearby warming crib, John leaned heavily against the wall, his knees nearly buckling from the release of pressure. He had walked miles in the storm without food, without rest, driven only by the fear that his daughter might die in his arms. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing Sarah's laugh in memory, then opened them to the sterile brightness of the emergency room. Laura approached quietly. She was tall, her winter cap removed now, revealing neatly pulled back brown hair. Her gray eyes softened slightly as she asked, "Officer Miller, you're on leave? I didn't know you were in this kind of situation." Her tone held more curiosity than accusation, though the implication of investigation lingered. John shook his head faintly, unable to explain everything with his ruined voice. His badge clipped to his belt glinted faintly under the lights, the only proof of his identity besides the exhausted lines of his face. Ryan, standing nearby, wasn't convinced. "Chief, we don't know the whole story. He shows up in a blizzard with a half-frozen baby. There's more to this." His suspicion was sharp, fueled by inexperience. Laura shot him a glance, cool and dismissive, but Hayes nodded slowly. "We'll get answers. But the child comes first." Meanwhile, Emily Torres kept working. She adjusted oxygen for Grace, rubbed her chest gently, monitoring her response. The baby's tiny chest rose more steadily after several minutes, color returning faintly to her lips. Emily exhaled quietly, allowing a rare moment of relief to cross her features. She glanced at John, seeing not just a struggling father, but a man barely holding himself together. She knew the look. She had seen it in war, soldiers clutching photos of children thousands of miles away. In the corner, Buddy whined softly, drawing the attention of Kelly O'Donnell. "He's worried about her," Kelly murmured, almost surprised at her own observation. Ryan huffed. "It's a dog, Kelly." But Kelly shook her head, her green eyes firm. "Not just any dog. Look at him." Buddy had lowered himself onto the cold linoleum, chin flat, eyes never leaving Grace, as though he remembered guarding something precious long ago. Then, as if the night hadn't carried enough weight, a commotion stirred in the waiting room. The sliding doors opened and two men stepped in, shaking snow from their coats. The first was Michael Harris, early 40s, sharp-featured with slick black hair combed back, tall and thin in a sleek black overcoat. His gray scarf and leather gloves marked him as someone wealthy or powerful. His cold blue eyes swept the room quickly, calculating, as though searching for someone specific. Beside him was Victor Reed, his associate, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a shaved head, a crooked nose from an old break, and a demeanor of silent intimidation. They claimed to be visitors, asking casually about pediatric admissions, but Laura's instincts prickled. Michael's smile was too polished, Victor's silence too heavy. She made a mental note as Hayes exchanged a brief nod with them, though suspicion flickered behind his tired eyes. Emily, focused on her patient, barely noticed, but Buddy growled low, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest until Ryan tugged the leash sharply. The shepherd's amber eyes locked on Victor Reed, and for a moment it seemed as though the storm outside had followed them in. As tension built, Emily finally turned back to John. "She's stable for now, but she'll need monitoring, nutrition, and warmth. She was close to severe hypothermia. You did what you had to do." Her voice softened as she looked at him directly. "But we'll need to ask more questions soon." John nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief, though fear still gripped his chest. Grace was safe for the moment, yet the storm outside felt less threatening than the storm brewing within these hospital walls. The storm outside raged against the tall glass windows of Cedar Falls General, gusts howling through every seam as if the city itself was warning those inside. The emergency ward hummed with sterile urgency, monitors beeping, nurses moving briskly, but beneath the ordinary rhythm lurked tension. John Miller sat on a plastic chair beside Grace's crib in the pediatric wing, his broad shoulders hunched, his hazel eyes fixed on his daughter as if willing her to keep breathing. Buddy lay at his feet, head flat on the tile, amber eyes never leaving the baby. The shepherd's ears twitched every time the doors at the far end of the corridor opened, every sound feeding into a growing unease. Chief Robert Hayes leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his heavy winter jacket, his silver hair damp where snow had melted into it. He watched John with a conflicted gaze, part skepticism, part reluctant respect. Detective Laura Simmons stood nearby, flipping through her notepad, gray eyes sharp as she made notes. Officer Ryan Cooper shifted impatiently, his youthful energy ill-suited to the quiet waiting. It was Ryan who finally broke the silence. "Chief, those two men who came in earlier, Harris and his shadow, they weren't here for a visit. You saw the way they looked around." Laura nodded, her voice low. "And the dog's reaction wasn't random. Shepherds like him don't growl without reason." She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Something's off." Almost as if summoned by her words, the doors at the far end opened again. This time, it wasn't a stranger in a polished coat, but Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean with an angular face softened by tired brown eyes. Her black hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and her dark suit was practical, layered with a wool overcoat that still carried flecks of snow. Sarah's presence carried authority, but her tone when she spoke was measured, almost gentle. Years of undercover work had taught her how to blend empathy with firmness. She had grown up in Chicago's Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who ran a corner grocery, and had seen firsthand how vulnerable families could be exploited. That past made her relentless in cases involving children. She flashed her badge. "Special Agent Chen, FBI. We've been tracking an adoption fraud ring operating across state lines. I believe your patient and her father may be connected to our investigation." Hayes stiffened. "You're saying this man is a suspect?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, I'm saying he might be a target." She walked closer, her gaze softening as she looked at Grace. "We've intercepted chatter about a child that certain individuals were desperate to acquire. The description matches this infant." She turned to John, studying his gaunt face, the deep exhaustion carved into his features. "Mr. Miller, your wife, before she passed, did she ever mention anyone pressing her to sign adoption papers?" John's throat tightened. His voice, raspy and uneven, struggled through the words. "Yes, a woman, claimed to be her cousin. Kept calling." Sarah refused. His hazel eyes darkened, grief mixing with anger. "She died 2 days later." Sarah's expression hardened. "We've seen this pattern before. Vulnerable families approached under the guise of help, then threatened when they resist. Your wife may have been silenced." Ryan shifted uneasily, suddenly less certain of his suspicion. Hayes's jaw clenched. His grief for his own son flickered in his pale blue eyes as he muttered, "So the vultures are circling again." Buddy growled low, ears swiveling. Down the hall, Michael Harris reappeared, his sleek black overcoat pristine despite the storm, Victor Reed trailing close behind with his heavy frame and cold eyes. They pretended nonchalance, but Harris's gaze lingered too long on Grace's crib. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That's them," she whispered to Hayes and Laura. "Harris fronts the adoption ring. Reed does his dirty work." Before confrontation could escalate, the hospital lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the corridor into momentary shadow. A collective gasp rose from the nurses. Backup generators kicked in, humming to life, but the lights now glowed dimmer, stretched shadows creeping across the walls. Nurse Kelly O'Donnell rushed out of a side room, her red hair messy from tugging off her cap, her green eyes wide. "Chief, the security feeds just went down with the power." "We're blind." Nurse Adam White followed, calm but tense, murmuring, "This wasn't a random outage." Sarah's instincts sharpened. She lowered her voice, but her tone carried steel. "They're here for the baby. We need to secure her now." John rose to his feet, his tall frame tense, fists clenching though he had no weapon. Buddy stood too, hackles raised, a rumble vibrating in his chest. The shepherd positioned himself between Grace's crib and the approaching shadows as if he had always belonged there. Victor Reed shifted slightly, a motion too subtle for most, but not for Buddy. The dog's amber eyes locked on him, body taut with memory. In another life, Reed had been around war zones too. Buddy remembered his scent, his cruelty. A growl, low and guttural, filled the hall. Hayes's voice was sharp. "Ryan, lock down the exits. Laura, get hospital security on every door. Nobody in or out without my say." But Sarah Chen, her brown eyes steady, spoke with quiet urgency. "It may already be too late. They've planned this. If they cut the lights, they'll try to move under cover. We need to keep the child in sight no matter what." Grace whimpered softly, stirring in her crib. John bent quickly, his rough hands adjusting the blanket around her, whispering in his broken voice, "Daddy's here." His grief and fear blended into a vow, his eyes burning not with exhaustion but with a flicker of the same fire that had once made him one of Minneapolis's most reliable officers. The storm outside slammed against the hospital walls. Inside, beneath dim emergency lights and the hum of failing systems, the real storm had only just begun. The hospital's fluorescent lights had dimmed to a sickly yellow after the power cut, and the long corridors of Cedar Falls General seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with pale blue doors that now looked more like traps than safe havens. Outside, the storm had turned ferocious, snow slamming against the glass panels as though nature itself was warning them of what was about to unfold. John Miller stood protectively near Grace's crib, his worn police jacket buttoned to his throat, though the chill came from inside, not out. His face gaunt, shadowed by grief and exhaustion, was taut with focus, hazel eyes locked on the fragile life he was sworn to protect. His 6-foot frame bent slightly, every muscle taut with tension. One hand on the crib, the other hovering near Buddy's harness as if ready to unleash the dog if danger broke through. Buddy, the 6-year-old German shepherd, was no ordinary pet. His muscular frame and thick black and tan fur gleamed even in the dim light, his amber eyes sharpened into piercing flames of alertness. His ears flicked at every creak of the hospital, his body half-crouched, poised to spring. The scars hidden beneath his fur spoke of past battles, shrapnel once lodged in his flank, injuries endured on foreign soil, and though arthritis sometimes slowed his stride, tonight he moved with the vigor of a soldier summoned back into duty. Chief Robert Hayes positioned himself at the junction of 2 hallways, his heavy-set frame looming like a barricade. At 60, his silver hair was cropped close, his blue eyes hardened by decades of loss, including the son the war had stolen from him. He had once been a man buried beneath grief and bitterness, but tonight his grief steeled into resolve. He gripped his service pistol with the calm of someone who had buried fear long ago. Detective Laura Simmons adjusted her wool coat and leather gloves, her slim figure angled toward the stairwell. Her gray-blue eyes, always sharp, seemed to flicker like steel under the failing lights. She had grown up with an alcoholic father who often disappeared for days. Her childhood taught her to recognize deceit before words were even spoken. That sharpened instinct now told her danger was minutes away. Agent Sarah Chen, tall and lean in her dark suit and wool coat, tapped her earpiece, listening to static. Her pale face showed frustration, her brown eyes shadowed by tiredness from years of undercover cases. "Communications are jammed," she announced, her voice tight but calm. "They don't want backup called in. Whoever's outside knows how to run an operation." Then came the sound, a faint squeal of rubber on snow, the kind of noise a hospital corridor should never hear. Laura's head snapped toward the service entrance. "They're inside," she whispered. The first intruder came into view, dressed in a Cascade County deputy's uniform, his broad frame moving with crisp confidence. But his boots black tactical, not county issue, and his clean-shaven jaw with a faint scar across the cheek told a different story. His eyes were cold, flat, a man trained not to protect, but to take. Behind him followed 2 more, similarly disguised, their tool bags carried with the precision of men hiding weapons, not wrenches. Nurse Kelly O'Donnell, her red hair tumbling loose, gasped as she nearly collided with them carrying a tray of IV fluids. She froze, emerald eyes wide. One of the men seized her arm with a grip too firm for a deputy. "Step aside, miss." "Official business." His tone was falsely polite but laced with menace. Kelly's instinct screamed danger, but her voice faltered, caught between duty and terror. Buddy erupted with a deep guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a warning siren. His amber eyes locked on the intruders, and the men faltered for the first time. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her badge flashing. "FBI, you're not deputies. Put the bags down." The scar-faced man smirked, his hand brushing the inside of his jacket. "Lady, you should have stayed out of this." Before his hand could close around the weapon, Buddy lunged. The shepherd moved with the precision of his training, a blur of muscle and fur slamming into the man's chest. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon clattering across the tiles. John grabbed it, his damaged voice rasping, "Not tonight." Chaos erupted. The second intruder drew a pistol, but Laura Simmons fired first, her shot grazing his shoulder, spinning him backward. Hayes barked orders like a battlefield commander. "Secure the hall! Protect the baby!" Nurses screamed, scattering into side rooms, while Adam White, the calm, bespectacled nurse with years of quiet service, pulled Kelly to safety behind a rolling cart. Buddy stood over the scarred man, teeth bared, his growl low and unrelenting. The man's bravado melted into terror as he met the dog's amber stare. "Call him off," he gasped, but John's gaze was steel. "You don't give orders here." Sarah Chen advanced on the third man who had frozen mid-step. "Drop it," she demanded, her voice cutting like a blade. He hesitated, then saw Laura's steady aim and Buddy's snarling maw. He let the bag fall, the sound of metal clanking inside confirming Sarah's suspicion. Not tools, weapons. As officers forced the intruders to their knees, the storm outside screamed louder, wind rattling the windows as if echoing the violence within. But Hayes knew this wasn't over. He caught Sarah's eye, his voice grim. "These three are pawns. Harris and Reed won't stop here." In the dim glow, John leaned over Grace's crib, his rough hand brushing his daughter's tiny cheek. She stirred, her pale lips parting with a faint cry. Buddy, still alert but calmer now, moved close to the crib, pressing his warm body near the child as if creating a living wall. For the first time in hours, John allowed a fragile breath of relief. His daughter was safe, at least for the moment, but Sarah Chen's words shattered any sense of victory. If Harris is here, he'll escalate. This wasn't just about snatching the baby. He wants leverage. She glanced toward the secured stairwell. And Reed won't wait long to make his move. The corridor, still echoing with the aftermath of gunfire and shouts, settled into a tense silence. The captured imposters knelt with hands zip-tied, their eyes dark with unspoken threat. The storm battered the hospital walls, and somewhere beyond the snow and shadows, Harris and Reed plotted their next strike. And in the middle of it all stood John, his newborn daughter, and the war dog who had once saved him on foreign soil, now preparing to save him again on Christmas Eve. In the end, this story reminds us that miracles are not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog standing guard, a weary father refusing to give up, or strangers who step in to protect the innocent. Just as John, Grace, and Buddy found light in the darkest night, we too can believe that God's hand guides us through storms we cannot face alone. Every breath of a child, every act of sacrifice, every moment of courage is proof that miracles still live among us. It may not always look like parting seas or thunder from heaven, but rather the strength to endure, the kindness of others, and the love that refuses to break. So as you finish this story, may you carry its lesson into your daily life. Trust that God still works wonders in unseen ways, and that His protection surrounds those who cling to hope. If you believe that miracles are real and that God's love protects families like John's, write Amen in the comments below. Share this story to remind others that no one is ever truly alone when they walk in faith. And if this touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so together we can continue sharing stories of hope, faith, and the quiet miracles that change lives. May God bless you and keep you safe, just as He watched over John, Grace, and Buddy.